there! I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be the second half of my travel vlog and reading wrap-up. This is going to cover the fiction that I read while I was on vacation, and it's also going to be a peek at some of the things that I saw and did while I was in Cambodia. So the first novel that I picked up on vacation was Farzana Doctor's Stealing Nasreen, the title character in which is a 30-something therapist who works at a mental health center and has just broken up with her long-term girlfriend. Interwoven with her story are the stories of two sides of a couple who have both latched onto her in a way that isn't quite stalking but comes a little bit uncomfortably close, but is not meant in a hostile way. That sounds odd when I say it out loud. The evening janitor at the mental health center is a man who has been in Canada for a couple of years. He's just moved from India. He was an accountant back home but hasn't been able to get the equivalent job, and he's latched onto the title character as kind of an idea for what his daughter's lives might be like growing up in Canada. And from that relatively innocent space, he ends up doing things like going through her trash and other more uncomfortable things. At the same time as that is happening, the title character is taking Gujarati lessons from an underemployed teacher who turns out to be that janitor's wife, and she latches on to Nasreen as a way of dealing with alternative possibilities in her own life, because she had been someone who, before she agreed to her parents arranging this marriage with her husband back in India, she had been in a relationship with a woman. So she kind of looks at Nasreen's life as a path that her life could have taken, maybe not in her own life, but in a different life. And because of that, this couple creepily hangs on to things that the title character owns. It eventually ends in a wacky reveal scene that is a bit of an anticlimax, in part because I think where this novel succeeds, it succeeds in the small moments of these three characters' lives and their interactions with other people, whereas the stalking bit and the interrelationship of the three of them is just a convenient plot device that the other parts of the story that are more successful, I thought, hinged on. So I thought this was interesting, but I don't know that it necessarily worked 100%. This was Farzana Doctor's first novel. I really loved 6 Meters of Pavement. When I read that 4 or 5 years ago, that was actually one of my favorite novels that I read that year. I thought that was brilliant. I thought her more recent novel, All Inclusive, was interesting and did some different things and played with genre in a way that was a little surprising, but I didn't think was quite as successful. This one reminds me a little bit more of that, in that it's trying to do a lot of interesting things but doesn't 100% succeed. Still, it was definitely worth the read, and I thought it was an interesting take on both the specific lives that these three characters are living, but also the way people project their own lives onto other people. Because I think that's something that I don't see reflected on as much outside of stories where it has a much more clearly sexual basis, whereas this took a very different angle to that, which I thought was really interesting. Next up, I read Lan Cao's The Lotus and the Storm, which is a really beautifully written novel. I used this as one of the books that I looked at when I did the page 112 tag, and I'll link to that below so that you can get a feel for some of the language in this, because before I even talk about anything plot related, I thought the descriptive language that was used in here was very interesting. The author is actually a lawyer in her regular life, and given that, I thought it was interesting how poetic this ended up being, because I think one doesn't think of legal writing as being as artistic as this was. In any case, plot-wise, this novel is set primarily in two time periods and two places. It is set in mid-1960s Saigon and then in mid-2000s Virginia. It follows a father and daughter pair. The father in the 60s is a South Vietnamese military officer, and his daughter is a child. In the 2000s part in the US, the father is retired, basically dealing with being at home and being elderly, while the daughter is a librarian at a law firm. And the moments going back and forth in their lives through time, the dealings with war and immigration and loss and family, was really nicely done. And I would say for the first 2/3 of this book, I was just blown away by it, because I thought it dealt really impressively with all of those things. As it moves along, there are just too many coincidences, and there's too much else going on. At a certain point in the 1960s plotline, the daughter character experiences such significant trauma, and actually a pair of traumas coming fairly close together, that she ends up developing a couple of extra personalities, and it's not necessarily presented 100% as a dissociative personality disorder, although it's certainly presented as something along those lines. But the way that was dealt with never felt completely convincing, and I was never 100% sure if we were meant to take that literally or metaphorically. And I think it could work either way, but as the drama ramped up later in the novel, where we find out that people we thought were alive were dead, people we thought were dead were alive, people that we thought were on one side turned out to be spies, people who we thought were spies turned out to have ended up being tortured for being double agents when they weren't, and just ramping up drama. And obviously in situations like this where people are at war and then later when people are fleeing, there is a lot of drama. But the way that this was presented was not... It just became more and more unrealistic as it went on. And if it had been given the framework of this mental breakdown that some of the characters are having, that would be excusable because you would be thinking some of this might not be true. It's being reflected through the mirror of this person's mental state. But because a lot of that was actually presented through the father's eyes, it was clear that that is all supposed to be taken literally, and that didn't 100% work. I still think this was well worth picking up just for the first 2/3, which were lovely, and I really liked the use of language, but it just started out in a very realistic and believable place, and went for a run at the end that I think is very common in certain forms of genre fiction, but in this style of writing, it just didn't seem to fit with the rest of the content. Next up, I read Dionne Brand's Theory, which is a novella that traces a middle-aged PhD student set of relationships as they go through life. There are some interesting choices in this, in that we never are actually explicitly told the main character's gender. Very near to the end of the book, there is a line about the main character's brother where it's framed as, because he was a boy, the implication of which is that the main character is therefore probably female, but even then it's not 100% confirmed. So I imagine that this character is female because of that one line, but it is never stated. The story is also set in Toronto, but the mentions of the universities at which the character is studying and at which they teach is always blanked out. So there are comments about blank university and university of blank. And because it's Toronto, you assume they can only be talking about U of T, Ryerson, and York. But at the same time, the choice to take those out is an interesting one. In a lot of ways, I would say this compares more to Brand's poetry than it does to her general fiction writing. It has been a long time since I've read The Things We All Long For, which I remember enjoying, although not 100% believing when I read it. My sister is a huge fan of Dionne Brand's poetry, though, and I feel like this novel or novella is more like poetry than anything else, even though it's presented as a piece of long-form fiction. There isn't a lot that happens in this because it is mostly the character musing in their mind. Yeah, it's interesting to read something that's maybe more interesting for its absences than for what it includes. I found this more interesting than engaging, but yeah, it was a curious thing to read and to think about what the motivation might have been behind some of the writing choices. I feel like I'm describing it more as a curiosity than as a piece of fiction, but I think it works that way, so why not? After that, I decided I was reading too many heavy novels, and since I was on vacation, I thought I should read some fluff. So I read Julia Justice's The Rake to Reveal Her, which is part of a series of very formulaic romances set around the time of the Napoleonic Wars. Because I can never be completely fluffy, this of course had to have characters who have trauma in their backgrounds. The two main characters are a guy who's just lost his arm and his eye at Waterloo, and the woman that he's courting here is someone who had lost her fiancé earlier in the Napoleonic Wars and then her father at Waterloo, so they're both kind of an emotional mess, but they're dealing with their lives back in England in the post-war and dealing with orphans and class drama and all of that. As I said, it's pretty formulaic, so you know where this is going. I was surprised that there wasn't nearly as much what I guess could be called trauma porn, in that it didn't obsess over the fact that this woman is in mourning for a couple of people and that this man is in mourning for his life as he expected it was going to go, which tends to feature in stories like this, so I was impressed that the author didn't go that way. That said, of course, there is some additional drama that has to break them up and bring them back together, but that's how this kind of story goes. It's almost more fun when I don't enjoy romance novels, I think, because then I have things to complain about. But this was overall okay. Although I didn't believe the main male character, he had a lot of complaints about these horses that he couldn't ride, and I thought that wasn't super believable, just because when you go to rodeos, there are certainly one-armed bronco riders and whatnot. But as complaints go within this genre, that is pretty minor. And it made me realize that I haven't read a fiction with Napoleonic settings lately. It made me miss the Sharp series, so I might have to go and reread some Bernard Cornwell at some point. And then finally, I flipped over to another novella and read Graham Swift's Mothering Sunday. I saw a number of people on BookTube talking about this about a year ago, I think, so it had been on my radar to pick up because I haven't read anything of Graham Swift since Last Orders, which was 20-something years ago, so it'd been a while. This is primarily a look at one day in the life with some flash forwards to other points in the main character's life. This is about a woman who will eventually become a famous author, but on the one day that we see her, she is a servant in the house of some upper-class people, and she has been having an affair with the son of the neighboring upper-class family, and it is basically about the last day that they see each other, and the suggestion that that leads her down the path to the differences that happen in her own life. It's mostly just amusing on this day. For something that was dealing so much with grief and compounded grief, because one of the side points is that all of these upper class people had already lost children in the First World War, and this is set between the world wars. So there are ghosts of those dead sons floating around, so to speak, not in a literal way, but just that the photos are there. And also for the kind of heaviness of the fact that this is set on Mothering Sunday, and the main character is someone who was orphaned as a child, so the whole idea that she has the day off to visit a mother that doesn't exist, is that another ghost? Not really. And considering all the heaviness, I found it very engaging. It is a novella, so it was short to begin with, but an incredibly quick read. And especially since I was reading to kill time while traveling, I was almost disappointed that it didn't take longer. So I find that I don't have nearly as much to say about that one as I had expected to. But there we go. So that was a summary of the fiction that I picked up on my trip. I'd love to hear how you pick the fiction that you read when you're on vacation. Do you go for things that are light, things that are heavy? Do you feel like you miss out on things? Because I feel like sometimes, especially when I'm reading something that I think is more serious and then I decide that it's not nearly as deep as I thought it was, I sometimes wonder if that's because I'm slightly distracted because I wasn't at home and necessarily focused on the text itself. But who knows? I'd love to hear about that. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.